And thank you for joining us on the second day of China Week 2022. Today, we are joined by a great and a brilliant lineup of speakers and a fantastic moderator that I'll be introducing shortly. If you haven't done so yet, please grab a program. We'll have some of them display here this evening, and there are some fantastic events going on this week all around China's digital revolution. So I encourage you all to have a look into it and book your tickets. So tonight we're having a panel on big tech, data, and the platform economy, and I'm very glad to be introducing Arjun Karpal, who is senior technology correspondent at CNBC. Arjun will be introducing our panelists and the topic. But please join me first and welcome them all. Thank you.
Hey, good evening, everyone. As Jackie said, my name's Arjun. I'm a senior tech correspondent at CNBC. I spent just over 3 years in China, in Guangzhou, covering Chinese tech. The most interesting 3 years of my life, no doubt. So I just want to introduce the topic today before I introduce our wonderful panelists, and thank you all for joining here in person and online. So big tech and the platform economy. We've seen clearly huge changes to that over the past 5 years or so. And of course, we are in the midst right now of the Chinese Communist Party Congress, so lots to unpack here as well. 5 years on from the last Congress, it's worth taking stock of where we are. Chinese tech firms early on, 2017, 2018, were amongst some of the biggest in the world. You saw the likes of Tencent, Alibaba challenging the market caps of some of the US giants like Facebook. You saw them innovating and growing at breakneck speeds. New companies began to emerge, the likes of ByteDance, which has taken over the world with TikTok. But things changed from November 2020, when regulators pulled the record, what would have been the record-breaking IPO of Ant Group. That changed the game. Over the next few months, you saw swift regulation come into effect, taking markets off guard, taking investors off guard. Billions of dollars wiped off Chinese tech companies' value across the world. So the chat today will really tackle what was the motivations behind that change, what it means next for China's tech giants, what exactly comes next in terms of regulation, and we'll certainly have time for Q&A at the end. So get your thinking caps on, get some questions down to put to our wonderful panelists. Let me kick off by introducing our panel who are here. Firstly, I'll start off with Dr. Robin Klingler-Vidra, Associate Dean in Global Engagement, Reader in Entrepreneurship and Sustainability at King's Business School here at King's College London. Hey, Robin. Dr. Xin Sun, the Senior Lecturer in Chinese and East Asian Business at Lao China Institute here again at King's College London. Nice to see you, Xin. Dr. Liang Rui Jia, Lecturer in Digital Media and Society at the Department of Sociological Studies at Sheffield University. Glad you can make it down. And behind me on the screen, joining us online, we have Kendra Schaefer, a partner at Trivium China. Kendra, good to see you again.
Hello.
I've spoken to Kendra a lot over the years, so she's got some good insight during this panel. And finally, Dr. Eugene Tan, Lecturer at International Studies at the University of Leiden.
Hello,
so let's kick off this discussion. There have been a ton of new regulation introduced over the last 2 years, from areas from data protection to antitrust. They came in so swiftly. Honestly, you'd be there on a Sunday night, Monday morning, somehow the regulators had introduced some new regulation, markets crashed. That was the story that happened over and over again over the last two years. Now, this has really appeared to curb the growth of some of these tech giants that were very high flying, the likes of Tencent, the likes of Alibaba, the likes of Baidu, but also it's clipped the wings of some of the entrepreneurs in China as well. I know there's something, Robin, we're going to talk about here. But at the time, the comments were very much focused around the motivations. Why did the Chinese government do this? Was it about reining in the power of some of these tech giants? Was it the fear that some of these tech giants were creating new alternative centers of power? So let's kick off and talk about the motivations. Xin, can I start with you? What do you believe were the motivations behind what is being dubbed a crackdown on the tech sector in China?
Thank you so much, Arjun, and thank you for King's College London organizing this fantastic panel. It's a great honor to join excellent speakers here, and thanks everyone for coming. So my simple answer, Arjun, to your question is that the major motivation has more to do with political concerns rather than concerns about inequality, about protection of consumers, or about potential anti-competition consequences. So it's important to remember the kind of regulatory environment from which the tech giants have emerged over the past 2 decades. If you look at that old regulatory environment was highly decentralized, and also in many areas, it's basically completely regulatory vacuum, right? So from this environment, we have seen, Ant Group or Alibaba or Tencent, all these tech giants, especially based on platform economy, has grown into, super big companies. And the most importantly, if you look at their business model, they have focused on, basically building a integrated ecosystem that covers industry, including e-commerce, transportation, healthcare, education, a lot of other things, even including public services. If you think about what the QR code Tencent have developed over COVID, right? So this actually not only allow these firms to gain enormous profits, make them economically rich, but also allow them to take control over a huge amount of data and the users that covers, essentially every single aspects of individual economic and social life. So this data actually allows the firms to actually achieve sometimes the prediction of behavior, but also has a potential to allow them to achieve behavioral modification or behavioral mobilization. So they not only predict what people do, but they can also modify what people do. So this actually generates a huge capacity for generating, political influences. A couple of very quick examples. We can easily imagine that Tencent just twist the algorithm used in WeChat's platform, and that could change which political elite received the largest amount of media exposure among Chinese population. We can also easily imagine, if Tencent also twisted the algorithm used in the healthcare code, it can actually predict people's mobility, also modify people's movement trajectory. Right. So these actually can be used for mobilization purposes or political purposes, especially during crisis environment. So with this political influence in mind, it's very natural for the party to just impose very tight control over it. But finally, I just want to bring one more idea. That is, from the perspective of individual leaders like President Xi, another concern, and probably even more serious concern, is that many of these giant tech, they have formed deep political connections with other political elites, many of which belongs to the rival political factions within the party, many of which are the so-called princelings, the children of senior politicians and retired leaders. They are politically connected, they are politically ambitious. The potential political alliance between the resource data-rich giants and the political rivals is a huge concern. So those motivates the crackdown.
Fascinating. Kendra, I actually want to come to you just to pick up on some of the things Xin was saying. He was talking about the power of these tech companies through the fact that, they do gather vast amounts of data. He talked about the QR codes and the way that does create the ability for these tech companies to do certain monitoring, et cetera, And we know a lot of the regulation that's been introduced has focused a lot on the data economy, right? The cybersecurity law, personal information protection law, the law on the governing of algorithms, which is a fascinating one in itself. So just building on what Xin said, particularly on the data economy focus, what is, for your point of view, has been some of the motivation in that part of the market?
Well, yeah, let me back up a little bit. I mean, we have cautioned most of our clients against looking at the crackdown as a single regulatory event, right? Because for the Communist Party has for many, many years struggled, for the last 20 years, struggled with how to fit giant platform companies into the socialist market economy. When you think about it, this is really the first time that huge, powerful companies have been private in China, and quite with as Xin said, this much political power, this much money, this much ability to influence the public. So the party, you know, at various points in the last 20 years has kind of struggled with what to do with these companies and how to treat them. Besides that, though, there have been multiple, you know, I don't think there was, you know, somebody had a meeting in the Politburo and said, all right, let's kneecap our tech companies. You know, this has gotten out of hand. We look at, there were maybe 5 or 6 different regulators and different government bodies in China that were all trying to regulate the tech sector and all failing to various degrees because the tech sector was so powerful. So for example, for 5 or 6 years before the crackdown hit, the central bank was extremely nervous that fintech companies were being regulated like tech companies and not like financial companies. So they were, generating systemic financial risk, right? Collecting tons of financial data. And they were doing all of that without any regulation. There weren't any data collection laws. There were, they were kind of, nobody had said whether these companies were, financial services companies or they were, data companies, or what are they? There was also issues with ride-hailing companies who, for, like Didi, as we saw, that Didi got super trashed last year. But, the regulators from the Ministry of Transport had been after Didi for 5 or 6 years before that, trying, 3 or 4 years, trying to get them to adhere to the law. And so, there was also a huge push on data security, right? You suddenly had all these cyber regulators trying to get these companies, implementing laws and regulations on data and cyber, and we can come back to that in a bit. So there were all these threads bubbling along under the surface. Then, as Xin said, you've got this kind of growing concern about the political power of tech companies on top of that, right? And it all kind of came crashing together at the same time. And I think that's really what kind of got the thing kicked off. I mean, a lot of people say, this happened because Jack Ma gave a speech at the Bund Summit and insulted Xi Jinping. I don't necessarily think so. I think that's the case. I think it was just a matter of, all of these factors kind of bubbling together and exploding at the same time. And then the government basically going, we're sick of non-compliant tech companies doing whatever they want, and we're just going to go for it. And that's essentially what happened.
Great, Kendra. I will pick up on a point that I'll come back to very shortly, and that is on the regulators, because certainly the implementation was messy. There's no doubt about it, right? And we can come on to the motivations with the regulators. But I'm glad you mentioned Jack Ma. A favorite of ours. And I feel like this is where Robin can come in and talk to us a bit. Because as Kendra mentioned, there was a view at the time that Mr. Ma had made some comments that rubbed the regulators up the wrong way. And therefore, they decided to pull the $35 billion IPO of Ant Group, which was insane. I had traveled to Shanghai at the time. It was the 3rd of November, and the IPO was supposed to go on the 5th of November. Dropped my bags down. I was very looking forward to heading out, having some Xiaolong Bao. And then my phone starts exploding because all my US colleagues are like, the Ant Group IPO has been pulled. I was like, I don't know. I've just got to the hotel. And then, lo and behold, it went like that. And it was insane. I'd never experienced anything like that. We were on the streets of Shanghai the next morning reporting on it. But there was this view that it was because of Jack Ma's comments. There was this view that actually there was a fear within the party that entrepreneurs were just getting too big for their boots. How true is that in your view? How much was this regulatory push tightening about reining in some of that outsized or perceived outsized power?
It's fascinating. First, so thanks for the introduction, and it's so fun to see so many people that I learned from, Jane, Jan, and others here. Others on the panel as well. So thanks for having me. So is it that the entrepreneurs like Jack Ma got too big for their boots? I mean, if you polled people, Jack Ma is one of the most famous people in the world, right? So his ability to affect sentiment is massive. Perhaps, I mean, the way that I would come at it is a bit different, is looking at who is Jack Ma and why is he or other entrepreneurs threatening? Are these entrepreneurs not clearly compliant with the national mission, right? This push for years of, say, mass entrepreneurship and innovation, and the rise of the red engineers, right? So that you're both technically very strong and aligned with the Communist Party. I mean, I think over time, and so I'm a political economist, and I look at who are entrepreneurs. And in the literature, there's been for a long time this idea that these types of entrepreneurs who do really well in China are returnees, right? Are sea turtles who have gone and they've picked up, they've been imbued in Western practice and they've brought it back. And this is why they're successful in China. And interestingly, Jack Ma doesn't fit that, right? I mean, many of you will know he went to the teachers college in his hometown of Hangzhou, right? He doesn't fit this mold. He did sort of travel internationally. He had exposure, but he's very much sort of trained and he's a local person, sort of made in China, if you will, to use the government tag phrase. So Jack Ma as a threatening person because of who he is and how he got there, I don't buy, but this rival power to that of the state, which Kendra mentioned as being unique. I mean, those in the room who would consider yourself sort of comparative scholars, this doesn't feel unique to China. I mean, this is something that I do a lot of work on Taiwan, and this is the thrust of the Chiang Kai-shek position that the support was of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, precisely so you don't have a Morris Chang or, you know, Taiwan Semiconductor or Jack Ma, who comes to rival the political power of the state. So I don't think it's unique to China, and I don't think it's Jack Ma per se that's threatening. I'm happy to go more into the who are these entrepreneurs and things, but I don't want to go deep in my rabbit hole yet. See how we go.
No, we'll come back, Robin, because I think there's more to be sort of spoken about on the changing nature and relationships between entrepreneurs and the state and tech companies in the state. And we'll definitely get into that. But I just want to have a round from everyone for their opening salvos. So Lian Rui, let me come to you and just get your take on where you view, you know, having heard the other panelists so far, what you view as some of the key motivations behind the regulatory tightening we've seen, you know, over the past 2 years in particular.
Great. Thank you so much, Arjun, for your question. And thank you again for having me here. It's wonderful to be joined by the wonderful panelists here tonight. And just a bit of a disclaimer that I based and have come from a media study and industry research for the past decades. So my take on this is that there is definitely changes and continuities. So not only in the history of how media in China is being regulated over the past few decades, but also across the globe, right? So if you see in the US and in the EU, government are really ringing on big tech. So I think China is a latecomer to this kind of campaign style regulation of big tech. But also you see that on the level of individual users, there are definitely tensions about how this big powers are abusing their market positions. For example, force people to pick one of those two apps or discriminately price those delivery items based on your personal data. So it's definitely, I think it's not unique. And of course, there's a political side to it, and also looking at the political economy and personal history of the tech entrepreneurs. I think it's all those things mixed together. And one thing I would add in terms of how the media industry is regulated in China, it's very messy, right? So the internet, the commercialization of Chinese internet has started around 2 decades ago, around at the turn of the century. So the beginning of that time, there was really very minimal regulations, right? So you have some sort of security law, and even though China has just joined the WTO, so there is a cap on foreign investment. But now, if you look at from the institutional setup and to the number of laws and regulation guidelines that have been issued, there's definitely a bloom of various policy regulators and agencies that set up in China. And that also says that it's really a power struggle between different ministries, which I think also influence the enforcement. So I will end my opening here. Maybe we can have more dialogue in the conversation.
Yeah, that's great, Lian Rui. And I think that point about the sort of conflict between the different ministries, I want to pick up on that in a minute. First, I just want to get to Yujing here on Zoom, because she focuses a lot on Shenzhen and the model for Shenzhen and as a model for innovation in China. And of course, some of China's biggest technology companies are based there, Huawei, Tencent, and so many other startups as well. But when you look at regulations that have been enforced so far, there is a fear, of course, with any regulation, that this could hamper innovation in China. Eugene, what is your view then, with that in mind, ultimately on the motivation and what it means, therefore, a lot of these regulations for innovation and growth of places or in places like Shenzhen and some of the other hubs that are trying to be set up around the country?
Okay, thank you for asking me these questions. This is definitely my research interest. So when I answer this question, we actually need to think about there's two big tensions in China's political economy. The tension between market and the state, the tension between the central government and the local government, right? And I think I discussed the same topic with Arjun early this week, that the regulations actually comes from the central government. It's not normally from the local government. The local government is the partner of these big techs for a long period. And so here I want to address 2 points to talk about the motivations of local government to trigger innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in Shenzhen. The first point is that the local government wants to revise its governing model on market economy. So how to achieve that? The local government create partnership with local big techs and to contribute to the mass entrepreneurialism in China, in Shenzhen, which means that the government push big techs to invest in the small and medium-sized startups. Okay, so this is the important transition in Shenzhen. The second point is that the local government also needs to trigger new mobility in Shenzhen, because Shenzhen was recognized as manufacturing hub in China, right? It's a world factory in the political economy. But currently, the Shenzhen government want Shenzhen to become an innovation hub, which means that the local government needs these big techs to create more entrepreneurial business activities, form new scenario with local startups to boost its entrepreneurialism. So this is the 2 points I want to address. How can we understand the relation between innovation and state regulation on innovation? Still,
Great,
we need to think about the local government.
Perfect. Thanks for laying that out for us. And we'll certainly come back to that. So I just want to follow up on a lot of these points that were brought up in that opening round. Kendra, let me kick off with you, because you talked about there are various regulators, so many regulators in China at various aspects. You've got the PBOC, the CAC, and the rest of them. What was interesting, and I think I mentioned it in the opening speech, was that occasionally you'd be there on a Sunday evening in China and there'd be some new regulation launch. Next morning, Monday, US markets would wake up, Alibaba down 10%, Baidu down 10%, Tencent sold off in Hong Kong. What's happened? No one understood what exactly the regulation meant. It could have even just been a clarification on a rule. It wasn't even a new regulation, but it seemed like all the regulators were just trying to one-up each other. That might be an over-exaggeration, but how fair is that?
I probably wouldn't. Okay, so first of all, you and I were both in China at the exact same time, and neither of us got any sleep for an entire year.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was terrible.
But and they announced the Didi takedown on a Friday night at like 6 o'clock, and that just ruined the weekend. The CAC in particular likes to announce big regulations on Friday at 6. But in terms of whether or not I think regulators were coordinating, I would say absolutely not. And in fact, I think the problem was that regulators were not coordinating on that crackdown at all. What I think was happening is that, again, a couple of those regulators, particularly the CAC. So let me stop for a minute and examine the CAC for anybody that isn't really familiar with this agency. The CAC is a really interesting body. It is the internet regulator in China. It started out as a sub-branch of the propaganda department back in 2011, essentially. And then it became, it's not a government ministry, it's a party agency, or like a party body. And it was moved into its own kind of bubble away from the propaganda, a little bit detached from the propaganda ministry in around 2014. And its power has grown by leaps and bounds over the last, 6 years or so. And this agency is still headed up by old school propagandists. And now, 6 years later, they are in charge of data security regulation for the whole country, right? So it's just been this shocking kind of 10-year period where you've got a really interesting and body that is not really staffed by engineers, that doesn't really have a background in that has a background in newspaper regulation, frankly, and is now regulating the internet. They're responsible for censorship, they're responsible for data security, they're responsible to a certain extent for network security, and they're responsible for regulating platforms and what goes on platforms. And so, they have their own, that's what they're focused on, right? Censorship and data security, and they were just barreling down that pathway. Same thing with the central bank, same thing with, market regulators like the State Administration for Market Regulation, same thing with the Ministry of Transport. I think all of those regulators got the signal from on high that it was okay to push really hard on the initiatives, that they were already trying to implement. So the CAC went hard on censorship and data security, fintech regulators went, PBOC went really hard on fintech, and then you've got, education regulators coming in and essentially banning the ed tech sector. So I think just everybody piled on, and that was an uncoordinated effort based on a positive signal from on high.
And Lian, you also spoke about the regulators here as well, just building on what Kendra was saying. She's saying, well, like, it certainly wasn't coordinated, but was there an element of competition, do you think, between the regulators to please central government at all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Maybe just continue on a bit of the history of CSA. That's, the CSA was a great centralization of regulator power in terms of how the different ministries, you have, separate information and technology, Ministry of Industry and Technology, and also a variety of public security bureaus. So far, I think the regulation is still very, very fragmented, and there is definitely a kind of a turf war for who is responsible to governing which section. But also, I think that leads to the questions of just a very vacuum of how to figure out how to implement the regulations. I think with the personal information protection law, it took years for them to figure out how do we conduct, security kind of examination into those companies. So I think definitely there is an element of competition between ministries.
So I feel like we've tackled the motivations, we've tackled a little bit the implementation. So now I kind of want to tackle what impact this is really having on tech companies, on entrepreneurs, and broadly on the landscape across the domestic tech sector in China. And Xin, let me kick off with you. How are tech giants changing in the face of this tech tightening in terms of regulation, economic slowdown? Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, they've reported their slowest growth in history. But what happens now?
So yes, there are a lot of changes, over the past couple of years. Not just Alibaba has been down by not 10%. That's just a one-day job, 100%, I guess. And also, I pretty much my own portfolio pretty much covered the whole period, which actually shows that this is not a guidance for investment, as a disclaimer. So a lot of these giant companies have adapted their business strategies since the crackdown has happened. For example, on the personal level, you have seen a lot of these influential, charismatic entrepreneurs have been trying to hide from behind the scene, not being seen as driving the direction of the corporations. For example, Alibaba, Ma Yun of Alibaba has basically resigned from the leadership position and delegated its managerial power to a collective board. And the same also happens to Huang Zheng of Pinduoduo, and also Zhang Yiming of ByteDance, right? So by doing so, they can avoid being perceived by the party as making the largest decisions, and especially in case some political mistakes has been detected. But more importantly, on the corporation level, we have seen that many of these companies has basically, remember, as I mentioned before, they have built ecosystems. They expanded into different sections, different sectors, transportation, e-commerce, and social network, payment, etc., etc. That was the old business model. After the crackdown, the new business model has been, they all try to retreat from the expansion. They all try to decompose their business ecosystem and try to go back their main businesses. For example, we have seen, Alibaba has been divesting its asset in, many social media platforms like Weibo, and the Tencent has been, basically selling all its stake in the e-commerce platform JD.com, right? So they don't want the party or its leaders to perceive themselves as building this business empire, having the undue influence, economic, social, and the political influence across all aspects of polity and the society. And then finally, I think another strategy adopted is basically that if you look at the, so basically a lot of the corporations has been invited government officials to sit in their boards, or a lot of government corporations to actually hold a stake of themselves, right? For example, if you look at ByteDance, a shareholder of ByteDance is actually this state venture capital called the CIIF, China Internet Investment Fund, which is funded by the powerful central regulator CAC, as my colleagues have discussed. So CAC is actually one of the shareholders of ByteDance. So this kind of a relationship, you can see that, basically ByteDance allows the central regulators to hold a share, to send somebody in the board to directly monitor and influence the decision made by the company, right? So this way they can basically more credibly signal their political loyalty, but this also, basically restricted what kind of a decisions they can make and what kind of a trajectory they can take in business development.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up, Xin. You don't think, there was a train of thought that thought, okay, Alibaba, ByteDance, all of these companies are going to ditch their e-commerce business, social media, all of these businesses that may have been seen as perhaps bad, and start investing into hard tech, frontier tech, semiconductors, AI. There was this train of thought for some reason that this was going to happen. That's not the case, right? The Chinese government still sees things like gaming as important. They still see things as e-commerce is key to rural revitalization and a consumption upgrade and things like this, right? So this is not like Alibaba is going to chuck away the e-commerce business or Tencent's going to throw away gaming, right?
No, it's definitely not the case. But we have seen that, basically they try to shrink their major businesses into a small number of, sections, right? For example, if social media is the main businesses and the gaming is the main businesses, then Tencent does not definitely want to itself to be seen like also making a lot of investment in, for example, transportation, e-commerce, right? Which are sometimes irrelevant or, not very strongly related businesses, right? So they just try to, if some of you are from China, you realize that in major cities, a lot of tech companies has been, laying off their workers, right? So basically the workers who are getting laid off are from these minor sectors who are unrelated from the main business lines. So that's what they're trying to do.
Robin, for you, when you look at it, Xin made the point there about a number of these founders, in particular, founder CEO types retreating from sort of the front lines in some sense, certainly out of the limelight, and appearing to invest a lot of time in the project of common prosperity or some sort of charity efforts as well. Just a couple of questions. What does the regulatory tightening, the changing political landscape mean for the type of entrepreneur we might see now out of China? And secondly, what does it mean for the relationship between entrepreneurs and the state?
So does everyone know the word culture, right? There was the 996, and I see Jiawei, who I think originally told me about this. So it was the 996 that the expectation is you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And then it became that wasn't intense enough. And it's now 007, James Bond style, right? So that you work all the time, 7 days a week. And personalities like Jack Ma were very much building this and supporting and saying, we're so intense. This is why we're going to be so good. And they retreated from that. And now increasingly you see rhetoric around, softening. We need to pace ourselves more and move from this. So I think there's some change in sort of the positioning there. also you mentioned the rural revitalization. I mean, thinking Taobao villages, Pinduoduo, that it's framed around partnering with the rural governments to build infrastructure, logistics. So if we want, handicrafts to be sold around the country and around the world, we need airports, we need the infrastructure in order to do that. And then Alibaba, Pinduoduo are the partners who are helping to do that. So I think you see part of this nation building, whole of nation approach coming more and more from these personalities. I mean, I would also say that so Jia Wei, who I keep talking about, who's just here in the front, who's a PhD student of ours and who's wonderful and is soon to be on the job market. So Jia Wei and I were interested because you hear a lot of this, the state is cracking down and it's dictating entrepreneurs what they can do. And we said, well, we want to see what this actually looks like. And you have the examples of, I mean, by the way, we were talking about Didi. For me, they listed on the New York Stock Exchange. This was a no-no, right? This was anyway. So we were interested. So instead of these big high-profile cases, what happens with entrepreneurs who are founders who are building their businesses? Maybe not yet unicorn founders like our Jack Ma or Pony Ma or something. What happens to them? And so we looked at the blockchain sector and we looked at the company descriptions of all of the blockchain companies in China. So there's just under 200, by the way, which following cryptocurrency crackdowns and things and changing regulations, there's less. But we looked in May of this year and there's 197. And just to tell you, we were interested in where are they across the country and what do they do, right? Does the state, do you see that where they're located, if they're sort of speaking and physically located closer to central government, to Beijing, are they speaking more along the lines of what the state wants supposedly not? And just to say that we found that of this 197 companies, 110 of those who are doing blockchain are based in Beijing, 53 are in Shanghai, and a sort of measly 34 in Shenzhen. And relative to what we talk about as Shenzhen is the powerhouse, it's striking, right? And then I won't go into the details, but happy to talk later. That we looked at the company descriptions, the product types, etc., and did a text, sort of a data analysis to see how do they talk about their business. And those in Beijing speak as blockchain entrepreneurs as they're building infrastructure for the state, right? So it's part of at least rhetoric around the national purpose, the social purpose.
So what does that mean then, Robin, in terms of you examine that one sector, of course, do you feel that then there's a less likely chance of, say, another ByteDance popping up or another Tencent, focus on social media, focus on gaming, focus on some of these other areas that are perhaps perceived as slightly more frivolous to the government? Is that what you're seeing? And perhaps rather than companies like Alibaba or Tencent shifting their investments into these sort of hard or frontier technologies, it's actually the startups that are, coming up now, getting the funding that will focus on semiconductors, AI, supercomputing, etc.
I mean, that's my view, and the growth of the government guidance funds, government venture capital funds that have grown precipitously. I think that's certainly the expectation that if it's not a direct, you sort of must do this, that the support, especially the funding to grow in certain areas. I mean, also, I think that the concern about these companies having so much data, it's just worth saying that if you compare the data on citizens that Alibaba, Alipay, and financial have, thinking of work by people like Kai-Fu Lee that compare it to the data of like Facebook, right? Where it's so incredibly different. Where you have on Facebook, people are sort of passively liking things in a really lame data set. And then you have data on absolutely where people are all the time, not what they like, what they actually buy, what they actually do, who they're connected. So I think this state's interest in having a view and having a say in funding what it sees, AI, green tech increasingly as areas of importance, is happening in China. But I mean, also maybe you can tell from my accent, it's happening very much in the US with the CHIPS Act and where money is going and how it's being promoted across the country. So just to say that I don't think that, national direction, this developmental state idea, although we're not necessarily developing, that's not unique, I think, to the Chinese context.
Yeah, data. I mean, Taobao always knew what I wanted to buy before I knew what I wanted to buy. So that was good. Eugene, Robin mentioned there a bit about Shenzhen and how a lot of the blockchain companies appear to be based sort of nearer to central government, Beijing and Shanghai. What does the regulatory tightening mean for Shenzhen in particular? Its position as an innovation hub in China, but also what does it mean then for other places around the country that are trying to build themselves as, you know, the AI hub or the autonomous driving hub or the cloud computing hub, etc.?
So when I answer this question, there's one issue I need to clarify is about the essence of Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a special economic zone in China. So which means that it's a place to take a lot of political, economic, institutional experiment from the central government. So central government give a lot of opportunities for Shenzhen provincial government to initiate, right, especially the industrial policies. So regarding the question, tightening regulations on Shenzhen's economy, based on my field work, I couldn't see that a lot of regulations from central government to regulate those big techs or local startups, but the local government do have different narratives or understandings about these central government policies. They want to, on one hand, flatter these central government policies, on the other hand, to create their new space to trigger local investment. For example, the local government of Shenzhen create some of the special funding to invest in startups. And this is the story that I can see from Shenzhen.
So do you think that Shenzhen will continue to thrive in this current environment? And if so, do you think that it sort of starts to focus on perhaps some of these areas like semiconductors, like AI, that are perhaps more of a strategic priority for the government at the moment?
Okay, only if the Beijing government wants Shenzhen become a new AI hub. So this is the job task of Shenzhen government to do. I mean, if this is possible in the near future, but I don't think this is possible. And Shenzhen became a new frontier for the Beijing government to include economic initiatives from Hong Kong, from Southeast Asia. So I think this is the near future of Shenzhen. So this is my understanding of current situation.
Great. Kendra, I want to come to you and just talk about, again, the changing nature of the landscape, in particular as it refers to some of the data laws we've seen passed. You know, we saw Didi being delisted from the US, concerns over the data they were carrying and the ability for that to be abused, which could, hamper national security interests. We've seen a push towards interoperability between platforms. So as you look at data regulation, what do you foresee as sort of the impact being, particularly as you look at things like algorithms, data collection, etc., for many of these tech giants?
Oh man, that's a huge question. What's the impact of data regulation?
Yeah, I mean, what do you foresee as some of the key impacts so far? You know, we've spoken about things like the algorithm regulation and what that means for these companies' ability to target users, and ultimately what that means for growth, for example. Sure. If you look at the business case at this point, what are the impacts as you see at the moment and moving forward for some of these in particular the data regulation?
Sure. Well, let's just back up a tiny bit and kind of give people an overview of where China's at on data regulation. So over the last 5 years, and really just in the last 6 months, China finalized the 3 basic laws that underpin its data governance regime. Those laws are the cybersecurity law, which came out a while ago, 2017, which deals with network security, the data security law, which deals with data protection from a national security perspective, and the personal information protection law, which is kind of like Europe's GDPR, if you'll excuse me for making the comparison. And so those 3 laws really just got finalized a few months ago, really at the end of 2021 and 2022, right? And so what you have to understand about Chinese law is that it's they're usually quite broad, right? The government will put out a very broad law, and how that law gets implemented is not necessarily defined in the original law. It's then, defined in follow-up regulations, follow-up laws, follow-up policies that come out, over the subsequent 2 or 3 or 4 years. So we've got these foundational laws in place that puts China about, and data scholars will slap me for saying this, but that puts China about on par with the EU in terms of having a national data governance regime in place. The US, for example, does not have one. And so now it's about implementing those rules. And 2022 was supposed to be the year of implementation on data security. And in some respects, it has been. Right? When I say implementation, I mean figuring out exactly how to, under the framework of these laws, allow companies to legally export data, which data can go out of the country, how companies can use the data that they collect, how they have to store the data they collect, all of that good stuff. But 2022 was really, the government was supposed to go super hard, but the zero COVID problem and the US semiconductor sanctions and all of these other concerns, particularly massive economic concerns, have kind of slowed down the rollout of that kind of stuff. So, and there's also, based on what happened with Didi last year, Didi got penalized for data security before the data security rules were in place, right? So, it was a real big kerfuffle. And so what's kind of happening now is some of the foundational or some of the subsequent rules and policies and laws on data are being implemented. And I expect that we'll start to see a stronger implementation for businesses over the next 5 or 6 years. But we definitely haven't seen those laws take full effect yet. Again, some of those foundational rules are still being put in place. We can talk about the algorithm stuff separately if you like.
Yeah, sure. Just on that algorithm regulation, it's obviously a lot to go into now, but just briefly, I mean, it obviously governs the way that some of these tech companies can use some of those recommendation algorithms on their platform. And I joked about Taobao earlier as well, but those algorithms have been pretty key to a lot of these tech companies' growth, user acquisition, and stickiness to their platforms as well. So if it's implemented in the way that we read it on paper, it could have pretty profound impacts, couldn't it?
Oh, so this policy, this regulation is my favorite regulation that came out of China in the last, year and a half. I could go on about it for way too long. But again, for the uninitiated, essentially what happened is, once those 3 big data laws were in place, in August last year, the CAC proposed a new policy, which was just groundbreaking. I mean, it was groundbreaking from almost every respect. The US hasn't done it, the EU hasn't done it. Those regulations govern something called recommendation algorithms. You can probably guess that a recommendation algorithm is something that either recommends content, right? It takes user data as it's being generated and then spits out some kind of decision. So it's either, recommending content on platforms like Twitter or Douyin. It could be e-commerce recommendations based on your past purchase history. It could be labor dispatching stuff. So, the party came in, or the CAC came in and decided to kind of regulate those algorithms. Nobody has dared to do it yet. And the states hasn't dared to do it because advertisers, right? If you regulate the recommendation algorithms, you're gonna kick advertising budgets, right in the knees. And so, but the CAC had no such compunctions, and they came in and they put a policy in place which was both a little scary and kind of great. It was a little scary because it increases the state's control over the distribution and dissemination of information, right? It says things like algorithms have to promote content that, quote, adhere to mainstream value orientation. Who decides what mainstream value orientation is? It also says, that anyone who runs an algorithm like that has to register it with the CAC. And that's what's happening right now. The CAC is collecting registrations from big tech companies on their algorithms. So, right, state control over data and information. But what it also does is give consumers a bunch of new protections in terms of being targeted by algorithms. Consumers are now, tech companies have to allow consumers to opt out of being targeted. If you don't want a platform to use your data to give you information, you should be able to opt out of that. And now platforms are starting to implement those rules, right? Algorithms cannot be used to violate labor rights, right? So for ride-hailing drivers or things like that, they can't be used to tag, you can't tag users with illegal or discriminatory keywords, right? These are protections that EU and US citizens do not have, right? Which is an uncomfortable conversation to have, I think, for Western democracies. So I'll stop there.
Great. Lianrui, I want to come to you on that as well, because you focus on e-commerce, on live streaming, some of these areas that have partly been targeted by some of these new regulations. So we've seen in the live streaming space a lot of regulation and sort of rules around idols and some of the things you can and cannot live stream. So how do you expect some of these regulations to change those areas like e-commerce, like live streaming?
Great. Thank you so much for the question. I think I'd like to continue the regulation on algorithms together with live streaming e-commerce industry. I've been studying TikTok for a while, and I think TikTok is a fascinating example to look at because it's the first real, like, globalized and successful private Chinese internet companies. And if thinking about the algorithms, I think the last US ban and the forced sale of TikTok in the United States is a really interesting entry point to all of these. So I'm also, coming from the political economy background a little bit. So my thinking, or maybe open for discussion, of course, is that algorithm has been securitized in the Chinese context. So the securitization have twofold. So first of all, algorithms seen or be understood in the policy circles as a part of national security. So algorithm has tied to anti-monopoly and then to information security, to the global China's place in the world and in the market as well. And secondly is to find a way to assetize algorithm as something that can be profitable in the long term. So there is a discussion about how much algorithm worth for TikTok if you want to sell it in the US, right? So how much is it valued? And also, like, TikTok, I think recently launched algorithm products which they can provide, I guess, an algorithm as a service kind of service to other companies. So if you wanted to have some recommendation algorithm that tiered or customized for your service, you can go to TikTok and they can help you with it to build the algorithms. So I think it's really finding a way to commercialize all of that without losing the control. So I think in my, just to connecting to the history of internet governance in China and regulation, is that there is really the securitization that's happening with algorithms. And definitely, I think any small twitches within algorithm will influence the live streaming e-commerce. And you see that even though TikTok has a Chinese parallel called Douyin, right? So the content you see are vastly different, right? So there is a way for the government officials to influence the content distributed on algorithms and also on these platforms. So yeah, so it's stripping the not only the market dynamic and also the content and information dynamics.
Great. So we've spoken about the last few years. We've spoken about the present. Let's very quickly, with 5 to 6 minutes left, talk about the future. Because we are, of course, in the midst of the party congress, and President Xi gave his speech in which he said the country needs to put a high priority on China's self-reliance and strength in science and technology. Of course, we haven't got time to go into the geopolitical landscape. It's a whole nother panel, but that's clearly a comment on that as well. So let's try to read the tea leaves somewhat, and I'd love to get all of your thoughts on how you think this all progresses going forward, how the tech landscape changes, how the regulation impacts, what do the entrepreneurs look like, how do they behave. So let me start with you from President Xi's speech. What was your take from it about the digital economy? Have we learned anything new? And does it give us any insight into what the next 5 years look like?
Okay, this is a great question. I watched the secretary's report on Sunday, and fortunately, it lasted much shorter compared with 5 years ago, just 2 hours. And unfortunately, still I fell asleep. I shouldn't admit it as a political scientist, but this also shows that this year's report is a bit of boring because it didn't really change much from what we have seen over the, especially past the 5 years. It basically reaffirmed the policy achievement and the success, everything Xi Jinping has, the party has done over the past decade. And basically, it also points out that we are going to follow this trajectory, very, very, with strong confirmation, right? So again, we have seen a lot of arguments, or, we have seen interesting signs coming out from the speech, like reform is no longer emphasized. Security, on the other hand, has become the, way more important terms. But for me personally, I think my opinion is that China is currently in the middle of a very radical transformation. And this is not just about the tech landscape, but also the overall economic growth model China is adopting. If we just look at the tech landscape, we have discussed in this panel that China transitioned from a decentralized, very loose or minimum regulatory environment over 15 years to this highly centralized, very intrusive. A lot of regulations are very vague and leaving so much discretion to the individual ministries and agencies. So that caused a lot of uncertainty for doing business in China, right? So this also contains innovation, contains a collaboration with international capital and partners. So this is a tech landscape in a narrow sense. If you look at the overall Chinese economy, why China could have achieved such dramatic economic growth since early reform period, the answer is that it's decentralized. Right, the local government has been playing a key role in fostering local investment, promoting local growth, working with capital, foreign capital, and the domestic capital very closely. And you come invest here, you get what you want. Preferential tax rates, loose labor practices, loose environmental practices, cheap land, everything you can imagine. But then under Xi Jinping, especially the second 5 years, we have seen a great centralization drive. Local government has been, their power has been reduced. The power of the central government has been strengthened so dramatically. If local government is deal maker, then the central agency is deal breaker, right? And each of them is a separate deal breaker, and any of them can kill your deal. Right. So this explains the headwind, economic headwind China is due to face in the next 10 years.
I'll just come to you guys on Zoom. Eugene, start with you. Any clues from Xi Jinping's speech about how you think China's tech development happens from here?
Yes, I think this is a very short, boring report, but especially look at a article regarding the association between society and the government. So the government started to look at the role of local associations to trigger new economic governance or social governance models. So this is the thing that I especially look at when I read the report. Why I think about this? Because okay, let's go back to what Xin just said. In the past 10 years, China witnessed a centralization process, but at the same time, the big techs, the innovations actually branded within these 10 years, right? The big techs was rising within these 10 years. So it let me think about to what extent the economic institutional innovation works hand in hand with the Leninist state, and how Leninist state trying to reach their hands to the society again. So that would be the social association locally. And this is the, I think, near transition or the trend in the near future for me to understand China's economic, the rise or fall down of economic power or something. So I just end up here.
Kendra, and from you, quick one, any clues about how China approaches big tech now versus previously, much of the same?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the reason everyone's saying the talk was boring is because if you've been tracking this stuff for the last 5 years, like nothing, nothing came out of left field. But if you haven't, I mean, one of the major trends, as you alluded to earlier, is that, the biggest problem in China right now, as the leadership sees it, is that China is beholden to US technology sanctions, right? Is this hard tech issue, specifically semiconductors, right? And that China cannot grow its semiconductor industry without foreign technology right now. And it is at least a decade behind other countries at the moment. And so, a big portion of Xi's speech on science and technology was focused on that. He did mention that that regulation on the platform economy would continue to just trundle on the way that it has been trundling on, right? We're living in the post-crackdown era, but that doesn't mean that, tech regulation is over. But I do think that those tech companies will be, based on the fact that the top line goal right now is to solve this hard tech issue and to solve the innovation problem, that platform companies will be pressured to utilize their capital and their resources and their talent and their R&D labs and all of those things to support state goals. So you will see, you'll see platform companies getting into hard tech increasingly over the next 5 years.
And Lian Rui, as you looked at the speech, anything in there that gives you a sense of any change, dramatic change in relationship now between private enterprise and government?
I think echoing some of the earlier discussions, that there is definitely a centralization that's happening around. And I just got this quote by Jack Ma. I think it was given in 2015, actually in London, where he said, fall in love with the government, don't marry them, respect them. I think if we look back or look at where things stand now, it's definitely
What a divorce, isn't
Yeah.
it?
yeah. And overall, I think there is a softening of tones in terms of the big tech entrepreneurs, like Tencent. Polima had just said, like previously, Tencent has been laying out these infrastructures for the country, and I think it was earlier this year or late last year, where they said Tencent is just a normal company, it's not an infrastructure for China. Right? So they're shifting the wind a little bit. And also you see how the upcoming regulation had shifted the direction and geography where these companies are invested in. So Tencent actually investing a lot of the UK financial services as part of the domestic crackdowns. So I think in my perspective, after studying the private companies, I think one fascinating thing about them is that they're not just totally subject to the government's rule in a top-down way, right? So they're really also very creative, and for them, they're also interested in return on investment in the money aspect. So for them, if you look at capital flow between this China and the outside world, there's definitely a converging of interest between U.S. capital, the big institutional investors, and this Chinese tech that going overseas, especially in Southeast Asia. They've joined hands, and in terms of investing upcoming e-commerce business in that part of the emerging market. So I guess we'll remain to be seen.
Right. Robin, I'll give you the final word before I turn it over to the audience, who'll have much more informed question than mine. Xi says in his speech that he wants to protect the rights and interests of entrepreneurs in China, encourage entrepreneurship. It sounds like stuff that he said before. Does this give you any sense of the any kind of changes we may see in terms of the relationship between central government and the state and entrepreneurs?
I'll be very brief. Cognizant that we're with a great showing tonight. Amazing to see so many here and standing. I don't know if there's going to be a massive change. I mean, I think it's just worth saying that when we talk about big tech that we're speaking about, and Kendra mentioned semiconductors and how there's going to be a forcing towards developing at a technological frontier, or at least getting down closer to 3 nanometers, which already we've seen huge advances in short periods of time, right? Where you go from 14 to 7 nanometers in an incredibly short period of time that took other countries and other producers years. So I think there's just going to be a greater intensity and a huge amount of money and resource mobilized in the area of semiconductors because of the imperative that's being pushed now by the Biden administration. But I mean, other tech sectors like AI have been overwhelming successes, right? So there's huge variation across big tech, and certainly platform that we've been speaking about is one of those big successes. I mean, maybe to a bit left field, but just worth saying that one of the things here, and you said not to go into geopolitics, but is about the movement of people and talent, and how do you develop in some of these. I mean, The Economist just had a long piece on China and Chinese tech last week, and they were saying that Chinese tech is good at catching up. It's good at technologies where there is an established line, and then catching up to that and maybe innovating on top. Thinking of social media maybe as a good example of that. And they say it's less capable in areas where there isn't a clearly defined frontier. One way to get over that we've seen is recruiting top leadership, what I've called in some of my work the sort of godfathers of semiconductors from different places, including really key people at TSMC and Samsung and others, to go to SMIC and to bring that talent and that know-how in-house.
Great. It's fantastic. And it's a nice way to switch it over to the audience. So please do raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, let's go.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the discussion and your insights. It's really helpful to understand what happened in China. My questions are, I want to turn the eye into US as well, because US and China is the two biggest countries, two biggest economy right now. So I remember like US governments also challenged the big tech companies, FAANG. And I remember like the CEO of like Facebook and Microsoft already show up like in the Congress and answer the toughest questions from the both parties. So what do you think about like the common grounds of the actions like between these two governments, and what is the difference?
Who would you like to answer that question?
Would you like to any recommendations?
Anyone got a particular view on that?
I'll take it.
Okay, go for it, Kendra.
Well, actually, I very often laugh at the fact that the US and China cannot seem to find any common ground on technology, because both governments are trying to do exactly the same thing in their tech sector to various degrees. I think you're absolutely right there. When you read these readouts from the Biden administration about what they're trying to do, ensure that these companies are not using user data inappropriately and selling user data inappropriately, that algorithms are not generating some kind of, national security issue by destroying national unity, right? By feeding, certain kinds of information to, just getting people in a kind of information cocoon and an information loop, that they are not destroying the mental health of the nation, that, on and on and on and on and on. So that they're not buying up, right, a ton of other small competitors, crushing SMEs and essentially acting like monopolists. Both governments are trying very hard to do this. The difference, I think, is, a very simple difference is that in China, regulation is seen as a pathway to growth. Chinese regulators talk about this all the time, right? That we are going to break some eggs to make the omelet of the digital economy. We don't care if we have to kick some things over here, or if some things break on the way. In the long term, they frame it as the healthy development of the digital economy, right? And all of this regulation is supposed to be about healthy development. Now, they got off track over the last year during this crackdown. And the reason the crackdown stopped was because you essentially had for many reasons, but one of the reasons is because you had a bunch of economists going, hey, the government isn't supposed to be pitting itself against platform companies. What it's supposed to be doing is laying down the rules, right? Laying down the train tracks along which those companies are going to develop for the next 10 years, 20 years, so that we can build a socialist, digital economy. Whereas in the States, I feel like we really just have a, regulation to put a kibosh on the unregulated development and expansion of tech companies, and our thinking kind of stops there. And so, yeah, I think that would be my answer to your question. Did that cover what you wanted to know?
Great. And Robin, you were taking notes. furiously. Would you like to add on? It's,
Between drinks. I mean, just to
Oh,
say,
yeah,
I
no, I'm
completely
interested.
agree. I mean, this national champions and public enemy number one. And that those tensions exist in both places. And
That's
we
true.
talked tonight about the role of regulation of the Chinese state on Chinese tech, but you have it coming from, across countries. And at some moments, Zuckerberg or Jack Ma are national heroes. And in other moments, they're pulled in front of Congress and there's campaigns where they're public enemy number one. So I think there's many more parallels. It's often that way, right?
Yeah.
That what we don't like
Yeah.
in the other person is actually the things about ourselves that we struggle with.
Absolutely. I think we can squeeze in one quick one. Yeah, one quick one. Who would like it? Yeah, on the front.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I want to ask one question about the international role of big tech companies in China, because previously we think those big tech companies are celebrated as national champion and those can compete with Facebook, Google, and all this tech giant. But under the new regulation regime, do you think those tech companies going to be as successful as they were before? This is the first question. And whether are they going to be as influential as they were before? Thank you.
Lian Rui, you were speaking about this a bit just during your live. Would you like to expand on that?
I think it's always in the state's interest to have globally competitive China-based platform companies. So I think in that aspect, there will be encouragements. You see this rise of internet diplomacy back in 2014, where the states was sponsoring Baidu's product launch in Brazil. So I think there is converging of interest between private business and states within their global market capture or their globalization processes. So yeah, I think.
Great. Xin?
So Audrey, I just want to add a little bit more pessimistic view on this. Because if you look at some recent cases, a lot of the times, data security, if you have a Chinese company operating in both markets, in the West and in China, it faces national security concerns from both governments. Right. So this actually, if you look at a few years ago, before the trade war, China always politicized foreign companies' businesses in China. Well, in the United States, you can still using the legal tools to sue the American government if you feel like you're unfairly treated, right? But after this national security becomes a top priority in both countries, doing cross-border businesses and sharing data and, under the same business entity has become very, very difficult. So I would argue, for a lot of companies, multinational ones and the Chinese ones, they have eventually have to probably choose a focus. They cannot do this kind of international collaboration as smoothly as before. Probably, we hope that some of these big entrepreneurial companies, they can come up with innovative solutions, how to, deal with multiple markets. I think ByteDance is a very important case to observe. Maybe you have your data stored with an American company somewhere, and in China, you have a totally different set of entity, but this is a very important thing to observe in the future.
And that's a lovely place to end it. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We've covered a lot of ground. There's so much more to go through. Jackie, we might need a separate panel, I think, on semiconductors, geopolitics, the US-China tech battle, but hopefully we've covered a lot of ground here. I've learned a lot in this discussion. I hope you all have learned a lot too. I'd just like you to give a wonderful big round of applause to our fantastic panel here and online.
Thank you for the fantastic care.
Thank you so much, Arjun, Robin, Shane, Liang-Ru, Kendra, and Yuying. It was such a fascinating conversation. I think we can stay here for hours, actually. But I'll invite you all to continue the conversation actually over drinks, if that's okay. If you get out from this room and you just turn right, you just walk a few meters and there will be a reception for us all. I'm sorry, Kendra and Yuying are not able to join us in person. Thank you so much. And again, please join me with a big round of applause to them all. Sorry, the drinks are at the Somerset room, so just a few meters outside here.
I keep writing things for the Asia